All right, Genesis chapter 38. Let's call this one acceptance. Why? Because it really goes back to Matthew 1 in Jesus' lineage, which makes no pretense about parts of his family tree that most folks might be ashamed of. See, Jesus was going to go on to be individually successful, but he was an individual who did not need to name drop and borrow clout. Why? Because his accomplishments were going to stand on their own, and he was not ashamed of the parts of his family tree that most folks, like we said, might have wanted to hide. And that goes back to this chapter in Genesis 38, where we're talking about a relationship between Judah and a woman by the name of Tamar, who is one of a number of women who were rejected in their day, who were part of Jesus's family tree. The other women being Rahab, the prostitute, and Ruth, the Moabitess. The Moabites being the people who descended from Lot, one of his daughters, who acted out in desperation after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Rahab, of course, being a prostitute, a rejected profession at the time. And now Tamar, who was the daughter-in-law of Judah, whose husband died, his son died, and ended up producing a child by Judah, her father-in-law. And so these are all things that were prohibited and socially looked down upon at the time that Matthew chapter 1 makes no pretense about is a part of Jesus's history. And we can learn a number of things from that. One, it talks to us about the scope of Jesus's outreach to people, because if we look at the Revelation in chapter 7, where it describes the throne of God, it states that before the throne there are people from every tribe, nation, and tongue, including the Moabites and other groups of people that later on in the prophecies are going to be noted for their wickedness. But God is going to carve out a piece of each of these people for salvation. And so ultimately, he's helping us to understand that no matter what your start is, the question is, what are you doing with that? And ultimately, we all grow up in a society that loves to stereotype, and our individual walk gives us the opportunity to either affirm the negative stereotypes about us or dispel them through individual excellence. And that's what we see in Jesus, an individual who is going to be extremely accomplished, who is not ashamed of the otherwise shameful parts of his origins. And so that should encourage us to, one, lift up our heads, and two, do something with that, meaning do the best that we can with our opportunity, regardless of the stereotypes that we have to deal with about our origins, whether it's family origin, ethnic origin, or whatever. We're all encouraged in this story about Judah and Tamar, that there is someone in our family who isn't ashamed of who we are. And as we've said in previous lessons, our obligation is to now go forward and give them reason to love us and be proud of us in spite of what our reputation might have become. And so in these three women, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, we see Jesus not being ashamed of them. And look at it like this. Look, if God isn't ashamed of those parts of his family tree, who is man or the people around you? Who are they to be ashamed of you, especially if what you are doing as an individual is characterized by excellence? So ultimately, at the end of the day, you can't always control what people think about you. But what Peter says in his first epistle is live the kind of life that makes the chatter about you foolish, regardless of whether or not it's about your past or your family tree. And so with that, the best to you, as we say, as you go forward in God.